Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Dr. Neil Ray, the founder and CEO of Raydiant Oximetry, a medical device company that has developed a safe and non-invasive technology that directly monitors babies' oxygenation during childbirth. This prevents unnecessary C-sections for women during childbirth while keeping the newborn safe. Neil is a clinical anesthesiologist by training who gave up his medical practice to build the startup. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about the underlying technology, the challenges Neil had to face while transitioning to this role as a founder, naive assumptions he made in the process, the lack of innovation in women's health, interactions with investors and fundraising, challenges that entrepreneurs in the medical device space face, trying to get the pilots at hospitals, and the go-to-market strategy, and the lessons he learned being a physician entrepreneur. I first met Neil 5 years ago when I was teaching a SBIR grant writing workshop at UC Davis and kept in touch with each other since then. And I'm super excited to bring his story to you. I believe this is going to be a masterclass for physicians trying to launch a technology startup. Neil, welcome to the show. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, and I'm so glad we are doing this.
Thanks, Naresh. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share our story.
Let's set the stage by talking about the problem you're solving at Raydiant Oximetry.
Raydiant Oximetry is a medical device company in the women's healthcare space. And the problem that we are addressing is that current fetal heart rate monitoring, the technology used to monitor babies during childbirth, has an accuracy of a coin toss in predicting fetal distress. Literally an accuracy of a coin toss. And so this is a technology that's been around for over 60 years. There's been zero innovation in the space. And what it does is it looks at changes in the baby's heart rate during uterine contractions to try to identify which babies aren't tolerating the birthing process. But the problem here is we're trying to figure out which babies aren't getting enough oxygen during birth, but we're looking at the heart rate to figure out which babies have patterns in their heart rate that correlate with the drop in oxygen. And the two are very unrelated. And consequently, it has a very poor predictive value in telling you which babies aren't getting enough oxygen. And that leads to two things: unnecessary C-sections, because we end up thinking that the baby's in trouble when they're actually not. And so to rescue that baby, we do an emergency C-section only to realize it was a false alarm. And on the flip side, there are babies that are actually in trouble that never get picked up on because the monitor failed to identify them, because it's the wrong vital sign that we're looking at to pick up on whether the baby's getting enough oxygen or not.
So they're basically using a proxy, heartbeat as a proxy for oxygen levels too, which is dangerous. And I think my baby might have come out that way too. They said the heart is not beating well. They rushed us through an emergency C-section too.
You know, in the United States, about a third of all babies are born by a C-section. And in this entrepreneurial journey, I've met hundreds of families that I've either experienced a situation or know someone that's experienced a situation. I was in labor, my baby's heart rate started dropping, and they rushed me off to an emergency C-section. It's a common story that we all know. All of us who have children have heard or personally experienced.
What are you guys developing? What is the new solution like and how much better it is? And talk about your product.
Because we want to know the baby's oxygen saturation, we're developing a fetal pulse oximeter, a technology that can actually tell you the baby's oxygen saturation. But what's unique about our technology, it's completely non-invasive. We're able to do it directly from the maternal abdomen. And the way we can do that, we shine light. We shine light through the maternal abdomen and bounce it off the baby. And that light picks up how much oxygen is in the hemoglobin, because hemoglobin has differential absorption spectra for deoxygenated and oxygenated hemoglobin. It's basically the same concept as when blood is oxygenated, it's red. When it's deoxygenated, it's blue. And so if you could pick up the color of the blood, you can quantify how much oxygen is in the system. And that's essentially what we're doing.
That's a fascinating solution. So maybe you can talk about how you came across this solution. Walk us through the process of what made you think of the solution and go from there into building the startup.
So my background, I'm a clinical anesthesiologist, been in clinical practice for about 10 years before I came up with the idea. And as an anesthesiologist, I monitor patients for a living. I look at their vital signs during surgery. And there are a couple technologies that I had at my disposal as an anesthesiologist. One was a pulse ox, which is placed on every single patient undergoing surgery in the hospital. And that tells you the patient's blood oxygen saturation at all times. The other technology I had at my disposal was a brain oximeter. It tells you how much oxygen is in the brain during heart surgery, vascular surgery, to make sure that enough oxygen is getting to the brain. That technology is placed on the forehead. And I had this idea, if we can monitor brain oxygenation through a forehead, why can't we monitor a fetus's oxygen through a maternal abdomen? And so it was my clinical practice and the tools I had at my disposal as an anesthesiologist that got me thinking about, if I have this tool as an anesthesiologist, why can't an obstetrician have a tool to improve their ability to monitor babies during childbirth?
So that was a long observation. You said 10 years ago. So what was that tipping point that made you decide that I need to do something about this? And it decided to go in a startup route. What are the options you weighed? Did you think, should I start the company or should I work with somebody else and let them build a solution? Walk us through that decision-making process.
At the time, I was a full-time clinician. I was on a professorship track, and I never thought I would leave clinical medicine. The way I was thinking naively at the time was, I have this great idea, and as I tell people about my great idea, they're all going to want to join and take my idea and make it a commercial reality. That's what I actually thought. I didn't think that I would be involved as an entrepreneur in a startup company. I just thought that I would be the ideation guy. A team would form around it because it's such a great idea, and that team would move it forward. And that was not the reality. What ended up happening was not everyone thought it was a great idea. And not everyone was willing to just give up what they were doing to pursue my great idea. And it turned out, if this idea was going to get anywhere, I had to do it. Then I had to make the tough decision. Do I want to be an entrepreneur or a clinician? And I didn't have a business school background. I didn't have an entrepreneurship background. And I didn't have a network to even know how to get started. So in the beginning, it was tough because I didn't necessarily want to pursue this pathway, but I did, and I didn't even know how to get started.
The first point that you mentioned is about people not thinking it's a great idea. How did you deal with that? I'm sure a lot of entrepreneurs go through this path where people who have sometimes no experience in the space come and say, it won't work, or it's not a good idea. What was your process like when you take that feedback, and how do you come out the other way thinking, I still need to go forward?
I think my North Star, my guiding principle, was talking to clinicians, people in the space, and recognizing that they all believed that this was a phenomenal idea. If you could make this, this could be very valuable in the care of patients. So I had the situation where I had tremendous support from clinicians, but not a lot of support from non-clinicians. And I had to tease apart why there wasn't support. A few things. There's been very little innovation in women's healthcare over the past few decades. And so it's not a space that people understand or knew a lot about. I would say labor and delivery, when it comes within the hospital, it's somewhat of a black box. No one goes there. No one understands what's happening there. And people who are sophisticated healthcare investors, they understand surgery, they understand cardiology, radiology, cancer care, but they don't understand labor and delivery or women's healthcare. So I recognize that the people who were strongly non-supportive didn't really know a lot about the space. You have to have some self-assurance that, look, I'm a clinician, I work in this space, I've got a good idea. It's not an easy idea. There are challenges, but if we could build this, there's a market for it. I had the conviction that I was right about that.
That conviction is so important for founders in the early stage. Otherwise, you're basically talking to wrong people in terms of recognizing where your market is. And that could kill a lot of good ideas. Speaking of market and connecting it back to your points about you being a clinician and a professor and having no business experience, what is your thought process about the market? Assumptions about the market versus reality over period of time? When did you realize that there was a product market fit?
Very interesting, because I was so naive in the beginning that I wasn't thinking about the market in terms of size or opportunity. I was just being the traditional physician thinking about how this could help patients. And I knew that there are a lot of childbirths in the United States and around the world. And there are a lot of mothers and babies that could be helped by our technology. I didn't know how big of a market that was in relation to other opportunities. I just knew that this was a big problem. There's a lot of people who deliver babies every year, and we could help them out. So in the traditional way that VCs expect you to think about market opportunity, market access, product market fit, I didn't think of that, to be honest with you. It took about a year or two for me to come across those concepts and quantify those concepts in a way it would resonate with investors. I was really starting off in the dark.
I see the same with a lot of scientists. Like I deal with a lot of grad students and postdocs trying to take their research and start companies. We're trying to solve that problem and not think too much about that market and how big it is and why an investor would put money in. I think that void needs to be filled at some level if we need to see more of these solutions come to the market.
And look, we're all smart people. A lot of these deep tech founders, they've got PhDs, they've got MDs. These concepts are not that difficult to grasp. It's just a different language. And just knowing how to talk about your product in a way that resonates to folks that are business oriented.
Yeah, I'm going to shamelessly plug this in. This is exactly the reason I run a program at Berkeley, the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program. Like you said, scientists are smart. If you give those basic tools of how to think about the market and the product and investors, I think they can do wonders. We've been seeing those wonders at Berkeley and other places. Go back to the question of you being a physician who turned into an entrepreneur. Are there specific challenges that you had, hindsight, that took a long time for you to be successful? I don't know how to quantify long at this point, but any thoughts on that? What did you think were lacking in being an entrepreneur?
I think about this a lot. And in my own journey, and now that I'm an advisor to other people's journeys. And I'd say the biggest challenge for me was believing in myself. And once I started to believe in myself, I could do, a lot more than I realized I was capable of. But in the beginning, you don't believe in yourself. You're not sure if this job, this role is appropriate for you. And a lot of people ask me, what does it take to be a successful CEO or an entrepreneur? So what do I do on a day-to-day level? The first thing I do is I sell. I sell my team, I sell myself, I sell my vision, and I sell this opportunity. And as a clinician, as a physician scientist, I never saw myself as someone who sells. I'm not a sales rep. I thought that those were two very distinct job titles and job skill set. But here's the reality. We're always selling. We're always selling ourselves. We just don't realize we're selling. And so once I got comfortable with the idea that I'm always selling, then it wasn't so hard for me to sell as a CEO, as an entrepreneur. The next idea was or the next big skill set required of a CEO is making decisions with incomplete information. We always have to make decisions. There's always more information we want, but you don't get that information. So with a limited amount of information, you have to make important decisions.
And you do that on a daily basis as a physician.
Exactly.
Who fits better that profile?
Exactly. So I was very comfortable. I had a track record. A lot of us have a track record of being able to make decisions with incomplete information. And that's actually a big, important part of being a CEO. And then being able to articulate a vision and being able to do it in a way that's authentic, that people will believe and support you and get behind.
You bring up a very good point about having incomplete information. De-risking as you move forward. As a physician or as an entrepreneur, they're very common themes. I really think physicians fit that role as an entrepreneur better than other people just because this is in their DNA, in their jobs. Speaking of that, you were a professor and a medical doctor. I'm guessing this was at UC Davis?
That's correct.
What kind of support did you get in that transition? Did they jump up and say, yes, do it, Neil? What was that process like? I don't see too many physician entrepreneurs. So I want this to be an example for others to how to navigate. So if you can tell the story along those lines, that'll be very helpful.
Without naming any names, I would say at a high level, the university is very supportive of entrepreneurship, but my department was not, because my colleagues saw my value in my ability to care for patients and spend time in the operating room. Me spending less time in the operating room and doing research just meant that there's more work that has to be done by them. Someone has to do the work. There's a bunch of work that has to be done. Someone's got to do it. If Neil Ray's not doing it, then that means that work is being, quote unquote, dumped on someone else. And so when people are not invested in your mission, they see your mission as creating an obstacle to them getting home and spending time with their family. And so I found that being an entrepreneur was challenging with my relationships with my professional colleagues because they weren't getting anything out of it.
You starting a company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was challenging. And it was challenging for me to find a department that would support it. I ended up having to leave UC Davis because my colleagues weren't supportive of the pathway that I decided I needed to take.
Such a shame. Just not from UC Davis' point of view, I think, because the way I see it, physicians are uniquely equipped to observe medical problems firsthand as they treat patients. I think if they can think of solutions, work with other colleagues of theirs, this world will be a much, much better place. Are there any programs that you know of that support physicians in such endeavors?
There are, but the reality is physicians, by the time we get through medical school, do our residency, do our fellowships, we've got a lot of debt. We've had a lot of delayed gratification. We're starting to earn finally when there was so much time we didn't earn. And it's challenging. Now you've got a mortgage, you've got kids in private school, you've got debt, and it's challenging to give up that salary and pursue entrepreneurship. Essentially live like a student again. Now, when I gave up my full-time anesthesiology job, I had 2 kids in private school, mortgage, car payment, you name it, right? And it's not easy to say, hey, I'm going to go live like a postdoc for the next 2 years or a resident. It's a challenge on the family. And so there are a lot of barriers, I would say, not only professionally, but personally, that keep you from making the plunge. And that's why I didn't want to be an entrepreneur initially. You know, I was living in La La Land. I had this idea that I've got a great idea and let me just find a team who believes in my great idea and they'll just move it forward.
Makes complete sense.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily willing in the early stage to do the heavy lift.
This is an important point. I wanted to bring it up because I think if we need to make this healthcare a better place, doctors like yourself need to get your hands dirty and help build those products. Maybe we need to invest in programs where they can solve all the problems you mentioned. There's Cyclotron Road and Activate that are doing a phenomenal job in the energy space where you just focus on your research and building the product. So maybe we need to invest in that space. Hopefully we can continue this conversation with the appropriate people later.
and breaking down silos. We're all so siloed in our departments and the way we think. And just the opportunity to break down silos and bring people from diverse backgrounds together to think about a problem. And I think I've been successful in that. I've got the ability to talk to business people, technical people, clinical, regulatory, reimbursement. I can wear different hats. I've got the now lexicon, the language, to be able to have a conversation with all these people and understand their different points of views and bring everything together to advance the mission forward.
Indeed, you're doing a great job. I've been observing you for a long time.
We've known each other for a while. Yeah, I remember 5 years ago when I attended your SBIR training class.
Yes, I've been observing you very carefully, very closely. Congratulations, you did a great job. Let's go back and go into that thread of you have this medical school debts in a family to raise. Talk about the seed funding. How did you fund the company initially? Walk us through that.
In the beginning, it's very interesting because I had friends who were angel investors. I had physician friends who were angel investors. And what they gave me was a real insight into the mindset of investors. And the first thing I learned is if you believe that your idea is so great, well, you need to invest in it. Show the world what kind of sacrifices you yourself are willing to make to pursue your idea. In my case, I gave up my job as a full-time anesthesiologist, and I took $150,000 out of my personal savings to build a prototype and file a patent. To some people, that's a lot of money. To some people, that's not a lot of money. But to me, it was a lot of money at the time and still is. And I believed in my idea so much that I self-funded the initial. And then after you self-fund, you've got to get friends and family to invest, because investors will say, well, if grandma's not going to invest in you, why should I invest in you? Someone who loves you doesn't invest. And so you've got to show the world that not only are you investing in this, you believe in your idea so much that you're willing to ask your own family and friends and put your personal reputation on the line and take money from family and friends. They want to see that. So after you've invested and you've gotten your friends and family, and it's not necessarily about the amount, it's more about the fact that you've done it. You don't need grandma to put in $100,000 or $1 million. If she put in $1,000, because that's all she can afford, it's more the symbolic act that you've gotten grandma to invest in your idea. And then once you've exhausted that, and they also want to see that you look for non-dilutive sources of funding, like SBIR grants. So after you've done that, then I think investors will take you very seriously about your opportunity.
Were you able to get any non-dilutive funding?
Yeah, we've gotten now 6 SBIR grants, phase 1, phase 2, phase 2B. I learned all about the SBIR program through you. So great course, and thank you for that education.
It was all you guys. I was just providing the basics. Let's stay on that subject of funding. Like, what did you think of venture capitalists when you first started this journey? Did you think naively that they were going to invest money? And what was that experience like? And how did that evolve? Now you raised about $18 million, if I'm not wrong, from VCs?
$12 million. Yeah, about $12 million and $5 million of non-dilutive funding.
What is that evolution like in terms of those investor relations?
Getting an investor to invest in you is kind of like getting a boyfriend or girlfriend to say yes to marriage.
Yes.
You've got to date them. They've got to get to know you. They're not going to just meet you and say, yes, I'm willing to invest. It's a long-term relationship. They've got to get to know you, see your milestones, make sure they like you. You've got similar mindset, and then they'll invest in you. So me getting $12 million of venture capital funding didn't happen overnight. It was essentially 3 years of dating different investors and getting to know them and making sure it's a good fit. You know, different investors have different theses for the money that they manage. And you have to understand, you have to get into the mindset. Although I was naive in the beginning, I got a really good education on the investor mindset early on. That was helpful. Understand how they think, what keeps them up at night, what their fund is looking for. Just like we talk about product market fit, there's also investor opportunity fit. You've got to make sure that there's a good fit. There's good alignment between the life cycle of your company and the life cycle of their fund. Because if they can't realize a return on their investment in a timely fashion, then they don't have a fund. They don't have a second fund. They don't have a job. So you have to understand what keeps them up at night and demonstrate that your opportunity has the potential to advance their agenda.
All fair points. And what were your good experiences like and what were your bad experiences like in communicating with venture capitalists? And what are the lessons you took away from those?
There are a lot of investors that didn't feel like I should be CEO, and they wouldn't invest in our company if I was CEO, and they're not on our cap table. And there are other investors that wanted a good deal, a better deal than other investors. They want to feel like they're getting a good deal. So there's only so much you can do to give one individual investor a better deal than the others. And some want board seats, and you can't have a board that's bigger than your company. And had I given everyone who wanted a board seat, board would be bigger than the whole company. So it's the art of negotiation and making sure that you're putting together a group of people that will not only support you when things are good, but support you when things aren't good. And how do you know that? You don't know that. And
yeah, how do you know? You're a first-time entrepreneur and there's a power play from investor, like they're the people with the money. And tell us that story too. How did you navigate saying no and how did that negotiation happen?
it's the hardest thing to say no to an investor or to get an email from an investor that you're pulling out. When you're desperate for capital, you know that you've got to get this capital in, otherwise your company won't survive. And you think that, all right, I will trade in my acute problem, which is I need money today, and trade in a problem for a long-term problem, exchange it for a long-term problem of having an investor that's not a good fit on your board or something like that. It's not an easy thing to do. And for some entrepreneurs that are listening to this, will probably be thinking, how many companies, actually have the luxury of picking their investors? There are very few of them. And it's not like I had that kind of luxury either. I would say things have a way of sorting themselves out. And if there are issues that come up in the beginning, it's a good time to maybe just sever the relationship and say thanks, but no thanks. It's not an easy thing to navigate. Sometimes you don't have that choice. Sometimes it just happens.
That's a hard one. Sticking along that thread, what are the investors that came through? What was that point that clicked with you, and how did you pick those investors, and what is the value they add to you at this point?
Our investors were sold on the mission, and they believe that I've assembled the right team to get this technology to the market.
And what was the mission that you sold?
Our mission is to improve childbirth outcomes and developing this technology to improve outcomes during childbirth. They were sold on that mission. They were making investments in our company because they were guided by the same principles that we were of wanting to solve this problem. They're looking for technology solutions that would address this problem. So there was good alignment on the mission. It wasn't about whether they could get an ROI necessarily. These aren't impact investors. These are venture capitalists, but they were sold on the mission. And so when there was good alignment there, then everything else could follow. It's not like our investors invested because this was a good business opportunity. That wasn't the guiding principle. The guiding principle was the mission. And when you have that in common, hey, we are here to solve a problem in maternal health care, and they are here to invest in solutions that address maternal health care. When you have that in common, everything else can trickle down from there.
Can you list those investors that came through, and just for information's sake for the audience?
Initially, some of our angel investors were angel investors that are medical device and physician focused. So there's a group out of Chicago called MD Angels. They're all physicians and invest in healthcare companies. And there's another group out of Texas called Angel MD. They invested. The Band of Angels in the Bay Area invested. Out in Boston, there's a group called Mass Medical Angels. They invested. So there are our first set of angels that invested. And then we were able to get, for our series, a lead investor out of Chicago called V Capital. They're agnostic to sectors. They don't just do healthcare, they're agnostic. I think they tend to invest in companies with a Midwest background. I came from Chicago, so I think I was able to connect with them. They led our Series A. And then a lot of our following investors were women's healthcare focused. There's good mission alignment with them. A couple of them were RIA Ventures, Avestria Ventures, Steel Sky Ventures, Fem Health Ventures. They're women's healthcare focused investment groups.
No, you got a great group of investors. Thank you for listing them out. Let's switch the gears slightly into your team. How did that team evolve? I believe you were a solo founder and CEO when you first started. Talk about that story, how it evolved and how big it is now.
So it comes down to network. When I started this entrepreneurial journey, I did not have a network. My network was clinicians and people within the UC Davis academic community. And we had applied for a medical device accelerator called the Fogarty Institute for Innovation. We got in March of 2017. And before we got into the Fogarty Institute for Innovation, we participated in the Citrus Foundry program at UC Berkeley. So we're at Citrus Foundry. And I think what Citrus Foundry really helped me do was talk about our opportunity in a way that was attractive to the Fogarty Institute. So had I not been at Citrus Foundry, I probably wouldn't have had such a tight story that would have gotten us into the Fogarty Institute. And so Fogarty Institute, they take about 2 companies a year. It's a 3-year program. So most accelerators are maybe 3 months, 6 months. This one's a 3-year program. In our year, I think they had like 50 applications. They took 3 companies. So Fogarty Institute taken about 30 companies in the last 12 years. But I would say 90% of those companies have done well. When you think about startup success rate, 90% of companies fail. At Fogarty Institute, 90% do well. Half the companies have exited, 90% have done well. We're in really good hands being at the Fogarty Institute or coming from the Fogarty Institute. And it was there where I was able to build my network. A guy that I had met through the Fogarty Institute, also through Citrus Foundry. At Citrus Foundry, one of the advisors was a guy by the name of Alan Kittner. And Alan connected me with a guy named John Maroney. And John Maroney was also associated with the Fogarty Institute. John and I got along. He believed in me. I'd say John believed in Neil Ray at a time when Neil Ray didn't believe in Neil Ray. I ended up asking John to join our board. He's the chairman of our board. And once John Maroney and I connected, he introduced me to an incredible network of medical device executives. And John Maroney is on the biomedical advisory board at UC Davis. And another guy on the biomedical advisory board at UC Davis is a guy by the name of Russ DeLonser. And Russ, you'll see where I'm going with the story, came from Nellcor. Nellcor was the first company to commercialize pulse oximetry. And so Russ came from Nellcor. John connected me with Russ. Russ took a look at our science, our data. He's like, oh my God, I got to join this company. And we ended up bringing Russ on board as the president and COO. So Russ coming from Nellcor, he knew a bunch of other people who came from Nellcor. And so today we've got 9 full-time employees. 5 have come from Nellcor. 5 actually were in pulse oximetry. It's the network effect. And this is a network that I didn't necessarily initially have access to, but I was able to build over time. Once I got to know Russ, and Russ has 30 years of medical device experience in the Bay Area, and he's got a network, and it takes Russ about 3 seconds to think of someone who can solve this particular problem.
I'm glad you met these people, Alan, John, Russ. Say more about the Fogarty Institute. It's fascinating. You mentioned about 90% successful companies. What do you attribute that? What were the biggest things other than the network that helped you or you picked up from there?
Dr. Fogarty, he's guided by the principle of solving unmet clinical needs. It all comes down to what is the problem you're trying to solve? Can you convince someone that the problem you're trying to solve is worth 10 years of my life and $30, $40, $50 million of investment to solve it? Because if it's a big problem, he can find resources and capital to solve that problem. They go after big problems. And what I like about the Fogarty Institute is they are starting to go after big problems in women's healthcare as well as pediatrics. These are traditionally sectors that have been ignored, and there's been very little innovation in women's healthcare. And of the 30 companies that have gone through the Fogarty Institute, 5 have been in women's healthcare. 2 already have had blockbuster exits. And I really believe in my heart of hearts that all 5 of these women's healthcare companies are going to have blockbuster exits because they're solving such large unmet clinical needs that have been ignored forever. And they've got unique, compelling solutions. There's a lot of women out there who are looking for technologies to make their healthcare needs better.
And then thanks to entrepreneurs like yourself, like we need more of you. And we need believers. You mentioned John was the one who believed in you, and they play such a big role, man. I'm telling you, like, I think as scientists and our people coming from academia, we are low on that confidence level.
That's right.
And trust in ourselves. Once you find those champions, it's almost like a common theme of every entrepreneur that I've been talking to so far.
From the outside, people can see things in you that you can't see in yourself. Until you believe that, you're kind of getting in your own way of your own success.
Now we had the money and all these relations, and like say more about the prototyping process and the pilots. You had to test something out. The reason I asked about pilots is because any medical device equipment, it's really hard to get into a hospital to test those things.
Super hard. There's so many layers that want to say no. It's so easy for people to say no. It's almost like you're more likely to get fired by saying yes than saying no. The status quo is to say no. And I appreciate the question. It comes down to a champion. You need to find a champion, someone who believes so much in your technology that they're willing to go to bat and go to their hospital and to their IRB and put their name on that protocol and say, I want to be the PI and I want to do this study and this is important to me and this can advance my career development and help me take better care of patients. So you've got to find champions, because without champions, you're just an annoying company. They're going to charge you a lot of money. When you have champions too, you can negotiate the price. You'll get to do things for a lot cheaper than when you don't. So it's all about, you've just got to find the people who share your vision and believe in what you're doing.
Being an insider for you, I'm sure has helped. And I've gone through my own startup. It was a tough path to get some studies done at this hospitals. And as you said, it's expensive. I really wish that system changes. It's almost like there's a need for like some public relations office somewhere where an entrepreneur can bring and people can actually look out for these solutions and willing to work with them. That is needed. And I don't know how to solve that problem. It is really hard.
It's really hard. Yeah.
Any thoughts from your end, like what we could do or what system could do to facilitate such adoptions, pilots?
First of all, if you're going to take the entrepreneurial plunge, it's a 10-year journey. Let's say you've got 30, 40 years of professional career. So it's a big chunk of your best years of your life, so to speak, within your professional journey. You should make sure that you're working on something that is transformative. Don't work on something that's iterative, that's a Me Too product, that's incrementally better, but work on something that's game-changing, that's going to revolutionize healthcare or whatever, energy or whatever you're working on. Life is too short to work on incremental innovation. So work on something big, bold, and transformative, and make sure that people around you can understand why this is big and bold and transformative. When you get people believing your vision that way, it's almost like a religious cult. People want to be a part of you, be a part of it, be a part of the studies, and participate in this movement.
Incremental solutions are like really hard, especially in healthcare, if it's not going to really change the face of the problem.
It's so hard to get funding. It's so hard to commercialize, to get people to buy it. It's not worth it. It's almost not worth it. You're better off. And I'm sure, your listeners are sophisticated, they're educated, they've got ideas, but I would really challenge them before they take that plunge. Make sure that the problem you're solving or your solution is game changing.
Speaking of buying, that's a nice segue to something I wanted to ask about the selling to hospitals. What has your exercise been? Like, how does decision-making process work at hospitals for an innovative product like yours? Let's take yours as a case study, okay? Talk about the key opinion leaders, people who make those final decisions and write the checks. If you can help us navigate through that process for your own product, I'm sure it's different for others, but it'll be a nice example.
So we're still not through the FDA. So we're not in sales at the moment. And I would say in medical device, it's really hard to sell. The life cycle, the sales cycle can be almost a year. And it's really hard and expensive for little companies to sell to hospitals. Honestly, the big strategics are good at selling to hospitals. They've got the infrastructure, they've got the playbook, they've got the resources. They do it very well. What big companies don't do well is innovating. They get in their own ways of innovating. And so there's this symbiotic relationship in the medical device industry, basically where little companies need to innovate and then big companies pick up those innovations and sell. So you have to understand this relationship, at least in the US, of what the product life cycle looks like. We innovate, they sell. And that's what they're good at. We all should be doing things that we're good at and recognize what we're not good at, and then bring in the resources to take care of the things that you're not good at.
How has your thinking evolved on this subject? When you first started, did you think of selling to hospitals? Because there's a saying in the Valley that big companies die of lack of innovation that you mentioned, and small companies die for a lack of distribution. How did your thinking evolve around that?
It changes your trajectory and your milestones. Like what's important? What are the inflection points that you need to focus on to create value? As a medical device company, we're not looking to achieve a certain amount of sales. What we're trying to do is get certain clinical claims, clinical data to get certain clinical claims for someone else to sell. So it changes because of the symbiotic relationship. It changes what you need to focus on.
The reason I asked that question is because there are all these programs about customer discovery, and you're supposed to go out and talk to the customers. And I wonder if you ever did those interviews of customers, and how did you recognize your potential customers, and how did you qualify those?
NSF Corp's program where you've got to do customer discovery, 100 customers. And what that helped us do was identify who all the stakeholders are in our space. So healthcare is complex. When I think about all the stakeholders, particularly for my product, our company, it's not just the hospital, it's the mother, the family, the unborn child, the health insurance company, the FDA,
the reimbursement code.
So many stakeholders, right? The employer that employs that mother that's waiting for that woman to get back to work. Understanding who the stakeholders are and what their pain point is in this childbirth journey and how they see the childbirth journey interfering or impacting their needs. It's the voice of the customer, right? Voice of the stakeholder, and understanding all those constituents and how they perceive this. And can you create a story that resonates with that particular stakeholder?
If you have to summarize the findings from that NSFI course, from all your interviews, what would 2 or 3 main points be that help you shape what you're going to build and how you're going to build the company?
I think it's easy to get into an echo chamber where the way you think, you convince yourself to believe what you think. So you want to make sure that you're not in an echo chamber and you're not listening to the voice of the customer, and you're being honest, intellectually honest with yourself about your product and what you're working on. That is probably the biggest takeaway message from participating in that program for me.
I'll ask a more specific question along those lines. Think back to what we talked earlier. The number of people that said they won't need the product. They're used to something. They're used to measuring the heartbeat. And what was the ratio of people who said no to yes? And how did you make those decisions?
I would say the people who said no were investors. When I talk to people in the space, there are a lot more yeses than nos, which is opposite of the investors, which is a lot more no's than yes. When I speak to people who have a hand in the space, they get it. But they have different ideas about the claims, the kind of evidence you would need, the price points, the more meaty, important stuff that dictates your day-to-day operation.
Thank you for that insight. I'm going to go through that program now for my next startup. So this is going to be helpful for me because we hear such no's from people who are just comfortable with status quo. They're like, yeah, you need more data, so I won't use it kind of thing, rather than addressing that about 90% of the clinical trials fail. And your solution could help us. Rather than that, I would rather do the same thing and expect a different result. That's a tough place to be in for innovative companies.
And then you have to ask yourself, is that innovation incremental or transformative?
Nice validation there. That's a question you got to ask yourself. Well, let's shift the subject to your path to market. I know you're early on. How is your thinking evolving in that? You've mentioned about distributors, big companies, and partners. Have you started talking, and how are those conversations coming up?
In our space, there are monitoring platforms, and the two big companies that own the fetal monitoring platform space is GE and Philips. As we think about how we want to launch our product, do we want to be a freestanding technology or do we want to integrate into one of the bigger players? And so there's pros and cons of both approaches that we are always evaluating or continuously evaluating internally. On the one hand, they'll take a distribution cut, but then you don't necessarily need to hire a big sales force. It's not an easy decision.
It is not. Maybe I could ask another question along those lines. How do you think about the pricing about your product? How has that thinking evolved as you build the product? Because that is something people ask, what are your COGS? What are the profits going to be, especially investors? How did you come through that evolution process?
So we actually did a willingness to pay assessment. We used a third-party reimbursement firm who did a willingness to pay assessment for us. So it's a formal marketing survey. And then you build a health economic story around that price point that you've developed, that you've been able to assess from your willingness to pay assessment. So let's say your willingness to pay assessment says the hospital will be willing to pay $1,000 for your technology. Okay, that's what they're willing to pay. Now you have to demonstrate that at $1,000, there could be a cost savings to them on the back end. So let's say you can avoid 1 in 10 complication. Each complication costs $100,000. So they have to buy 10 of them. That's going to cost them $10,000, but they're going to avoid this $100,000 complication. So you have to create that health economic story. And this is not unique to medical devices. This is to any startup creating that economic story of why that upfront initial investment makes sense to them. And they're going to do it themselves, but you can do it and do it in a way where they're using your assumptions and using your data. It's always better. You'll be more credible.
I did not know of the willingness to pay study. I did not know that there were groups that do that for you. I'm going to reach out to, probably we should bring them on this podcast to help us understand that way. Thank you for that plug-in. We're coming to the end of our conversation. A couple of questions before my closing questions. One is, any advice for physicians considering this path of starting companies from your experience?
10 years ago, I thought that my best asset was my education. And in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, your education is not your best asset. Your best asset is your reputation and your network. My advice, not just a physician, but also anyone considering the startup journey, is to build your network. And we're not necessarily taught how to build our network. Honestly, it's exhausting to build your network because you got to go out there, you got to meet people, you got to follow up with them, collect business cards. You're just always on. You're always on the go, go, go. But it's through building your network that you get the network effect and you learn how to solve problems, or you have a pathway to solving problems that you originally wouldn't be able to solve.
How do you define networking from your experience?
You can't have any assumptions because you just don't know who you're going to meet. You can't assume anything about anyone. I can meet some guy at some event. He could be a billionaire. He could be the FDA commissioner. He could be a venture capitalist. He could be writing a book. You just don't know. And you don't know what kind of value that person could bring to you down the road. Maybe not today, but in 3 years, 5 years, you just never know. So I would say when you network, you've got to be unassuming, be authentic, and see if you click, and kind of tuck that person's name away in the back of your head, and you plant that seed, and you just never know where it's going to grow. So don't burn bridges, don't be assuming, and it's a lot of work. But by building your network, you can create so much more than you could on your own.
Any closing plugins on behalf of Raydiant Oximetry to the hiring, investors, any message to users, anything? The floor is yours.
We're just thankful to have this opportunity to share our story, and we've experienced good success, and we hope to continue experiencing good success. We've got a clinical study coming up this summer, and if those results are positive, it's going to be a huge milestone of value creation and inflection point for the company. So we're excited. It's been a long journey. We're kind of halfway through it, just not taking anything for granted, and thankful for this opportunity.
And to my closing questions, are there any lessons that you learned from your mistakes that others could avoid during your journey?
I'd say it's okay to ask for help. Asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. And there are good people out there who want to help and see you succeed, because what you're working on can one day help a family member of mine. And I want to see your technology succeed and you succeed. And if you need help, let us know, and we'll see what we can do to help you. I think overall, the ecosystem here in the Bay Area is vibrant. It's collaborative. We want to see everyone succeed, and don't be afraid to ask for help.
And my second question is, are there people that you'd like to acknowledge that helped you with your success so far with your journey?
Definitely my wife and my family. The startup journey, it's a family journey.
It's hard on the family.
It's hard on the family.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be here without their support. I've got an incredible board, incredible group of investors, and a lot of people that believe in our mission and want to see us be successful. So I think it takes a village.
Excellent. Neil, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate you sharing the story, and wish you and the team lots of success. And I hope we can bring you back at the other end when you succeed even bigger. Thank you for this.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.